Kia ora tātou, reiringa terama, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko te arawa te waka, ko tainui te waka. Ko Ngāti Tuwharetoa rawa, ko Ngāti Raukawa o ko iwi, ko Garth Harmsworth toko inawā. Kia ora tātou. So I just wanted to start out with this work that I've been doing now for close to 40 years. And is that the right one?
On the side.
That one there?
Yep. Yes.
Yep. And so we're at the crossroads in terms of, you know, the human species and on the planet there, really, for embracing a diverse range of knowledges like we've never done before. You know, we're at that stage now where we really have to understand a lot of different knowledges and use them together. And we're confronted by a huge array of complex challenges here in the world. And so everything right through to pandemics. And this is the area that I came into in environmental sciences almost 40 years ago now. But why have I been so committed to Te Ao Māori? Well, it really starts with my own family, my whānau. I whakaaro kahua te rangi, Wikitoria was his daughter, and then down to my part of the family there with she had 10 children, and my grandfather, and there was Roger Danzy in the 1st Māori Battalion with Te Rangi Hiroa in the trenches, and George Danzy and Harry Danzy down below, who was the first race relations conciliated just after the 1975 Waitangi Tribunal Act came through. Another uncle who died in the Second World War, flying over Guadalcanal, and then Dick Danzy there. And our family have gone through and done science, but been very strong on that cultural identity as well, which has really been excellent role models for me growing up. And that's why I've been so committed to this area all the way through. Tom Allison, one of the first Māori medical doctors in New Zealand, and right through to my supportive family over there. And, you know, they've put up with me with long hours and long travels all around New Zealand for a long, long time, and I've been engaged with iwi hapu for almost 40 years, working out there with Māori communities all the time and trying to take my environmental science out there and engage. This is where I came from in Rotorua, so this is my turanga waiwai. It's where I relate to, and Tuwharetoa with Hoka Falls, Lake Taupō. My mother was just born just outside of where Nukahau Marae was, and that's really what really shaped my career and my view of the world growing up, and making sure that Te Ao Māori was still very strong in my science. So I went through university and did biophysical sciences, came out in earth science and biology, but I never gave up that Te Ao Māori side and that other side, and wanted to explore those knowledges. And that's what I've done since I got into Crown Research Institutes many, many years ago now, in the early 1980s. This is some of the first work that I did. I went out there straight away, had to go out the back door in those days because it wasn't the seen thing to do in science. And this is where I started developing computer mapping systems, working with Māori communities and iwi hapu, and how they could actually start to put together information on their land, but also around their cultural values. And this is the mapping I got into very early on. So I'd had a background in soil science and geology and vegetation mapping and botany. And I started to do a lot of work mapping the country, and we were splitting up the country into landforms. So I was brought into developing some of the first environmental databases in New Zealand around land resources. And this computer mapping was some of the first in the world, because even the geographic information systems we developed in New Zealand, they weren't anywhere else in the world. We were at the forefront. And this is where we started to take it, and we had to write our own programs to develop those computer mapping systems. And then of course in the States it started up as well. And this is where we started in trying to really map this land, but my thoughts were always, how could Māori access all this information we had in all these national databases and regional databases? How could they actually start to understand this information, but actually start to compile their own information into these information systems? So then we started moving into looking at different properties of land, and trying to understand soil characteristics around land. So this is that expression of tangata whenua, as the whenua, really trying to understand it, but from another knowledge system coming through, as well as the science. Work with a huge number of Māori organisations throughout New Zealand, Māori trusts and incorporations, and this is really what I tried to do all the time, was trying to make our information accessible to not only the public, but to engaging with Māori groups right throughout the country and how they could understand, but then what is the information they could bring in, what is the knowledge they could bring in to actually enhance our science as well. So it's really been a two-way process all the way through. So these are examples of where I guess I've managed to really walk those two worlds all the way through my science and not give one away, and being able to and I see it very much as the weaving of the two knowledge systems and the two cultures. Work that I did up in the Waiapu catchment with Ngāti Porou. So a lot of these projects, I was working up there for over 10 years. This work, even though I haven't been up there for a long time, they are still really important, and we still remain in contact. So we've never ever dissolved that relationship in any way. That relationship has got stronger, if anything. This is some of the issues that I was confronted with around the country. So I was quantifying and mapping erosion events throughout the country, and knowing that 60% of New Zealand is very vulnerable to these large-scale storm events in any year. This just happened to be Cyclone Bowler though, but the country's very susceptible to these high intense rainstorms. So these are the issues we were really confronted with, and my thoughts were, how do we engage with Māori, with iwi straight away with doing this work around country, and how could they actually use this information for their own planning and policy. So it wasn't really just a question of government policy and planning, it was a question of iwi hapu policy and planning. This is what happens on low-lying areas around New Zealand as well after these major storm events. So just as critical, not only in the hill country, but in the flatlands and the floodplains are devastated by these deposition events that come off the hills. And this is what Māori are confronted with, really in their own community areas, is how to deal with these problems and actually be engaged to actually make their own decisions. And this is where the science and the mātauranga Māori is so vital to be working together and expanding that out to other knowledge systems. We mapped 900 of these gully systems just in the Waiapu catchment, of some of the worst erosion in the world up in that area. And this is the thing, is what do you do? And iwi were asking me, where do we start? This was the whole critical point. What do we do? How do we actually address these major issues? So as soon as we'd had deforestation in New Zealand, this is what happened to our very fragile and sensitive landscape. These are the rivers in the Waiapu that were taonga, Hakarangi is the maunga up there, but these rivers is where they used to harvest all their kai and mahinga kai, and this is the state of them now. So how do you reverse this? Where do you actually start? And this is where I started getting into a lot of work around the country, working with Māori on Māori values. What were they? Taonga tuku iho. And really getting down to something that's quite tangible. It's not something that's just hypothetical, what's a Māori value, but actually something out there that was really critically important to a lot of these Māori communities, and how could we actually protect these habitats and bring back and revitalise some of this. And these are the problems we're struggling with even now. And so I've been immersed in a lot of the water policy work around the country, as well as the land and soils work for a long, long time now, and we're working on a lot of these smaller projects right up to government policy. In terms of Māori land, this is just what's been left. Of course, Māori had land blocks right throughout the whole country back in 1840 and 1861. We had the Native Lands Act, and then we started to get more and more alienation of Māori land. Critically important to Māori in terms of protecting what's left and managing what's left. You can see a lot of this land is still in the northern part of the North Island, except iwi now, with the treaty claims and a lot of other work that's going on, are actually starting to take ownership of large tracts of land in other ways across New Zealand now. So it's critically important with the Māori economy, is very much founded on the primary industry sector, and this is some of the work that I've been doing for many years now with these groups out there and how to manage this land. And so what I started to do was combine my skills that I'd had setting up national environmental databases in the 1980s, and then starting to say, well, how could we intersect this with Māori land? And this was very, very important, you know, sort of trying to get these tools so that Māori could come in and look at their own land blocks and look at the characteristics and the properties of land within those land blocks. And then we started to drill down into our own databases. We've got a huge array of databases right through from soils to vegetation to insect collections throughout New Zealand, biosystematics. There was all the work we were doing in biodiversity and biosecurity, trying to combine that and really focus on what Māori were most interested in, though, was coming in through their own land blocks, not coming in through a database that was just generic and at national level, but coming down to something specific. And that's really an engagement process then of where we could start that real conversation about what are the properties on your land and how are you managing it and what is the potential of that land. These are just more examples of what I'm doing even now with updating all the vegetation cover for New Zealand. So the discussion's now got on to land use. Just some work down in the Nelson area that I was doing on freshwater ecology with iwi around the cultural indicators work. And then finally, really around how we've been bringing science into Mātauranga Māori rather than the other way around. So this is really trying to bring the Māori values in, and you can see really starting with the core values at this side, right across to the outcomes that Māori are trying to achieve, and where some of our modelling tools fit in there. And kia ora tātou, and that's where I'm going to leave it.